Hello, everyone. Welcome. We've got people filtering in. Good evening. Good evening. Welcome, welcome. We'll give people just a moment to get settled and to join us. Good evening, everyone. Delighted you've chosen to spend this next hour with me. We're going to have a great time looking at flowers in art. They truly are the perennial muses. We're just letting a few folks trickle in. We've got four communities represented here tonight, and I'm sure far beyond that. If you'd like to share in the chat where you are zooming in from, please feel free to do so. But it's the Chelmsford, the Groton, the Tewksbury, and the Amesbury public libraries that are collaborating tonight for this program. And my name is Jane Oneail. I own the company Culturally Curious. I have a background in art history and in education, and I specialize in putting together art appreciation programs like this one. You're in for a treat tonight. I have to say, I really fell in love with this program. So before we get started, I just want to set the stage for us here with just the reminder of the rather profound role that flowers play in our lives. We think about it a lot this time of year. I'm sure you're going to a lot of performances and graduations, and we bring flowers to sort of honor the people who are up on stage. We bring flowers to court someone. There are flowers at weddings. We bring flowers to people in the hospital, and flowers are there at funerals. They sort of mark all of the important occasions in our lives. They are there, and the kind of flower matters, and the beauty of that flower matters. So they are, not surprisingly, a tried and true subject in the history of art. We are going to be looking at a wide variety of ways that artists have explored this subject over the years, and keeping in mind that a flower can represent simultaneously life, death, sex, fragility, fertility, beauty, all of these things. And so we're going to see the variety of ways that artists can approach this familiar but strikingly beautiful subject. So let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend this hour together. Here's our program overview with one of my favorite flower paintings of all time. It doesn't really fit into any of these categories, but I just had to share John Singer Sargent's Carnation Lily Lily Rose here. So we are basically going to be moving chronologically from the early Renaissance, the 1400s, up through contemporary art today. I've bitten off way more than I can chew. We're starting off with religious symbolism, then we'll move into the 1500s, the Renaissance proper, and look at the way artists of that day approached flower painting with a scientific curiosity. By the time we get to the 1600s, the Dutch Golden Age, flowers are an important element of still life painting, and we'll talk about the memento mori elements to those paintings, and I'll define that for you too. Then we're going to skip ahead to the 1800s, and we'll look at pre-Raphaelite paintings with the secret language of flowers sort of embedded in them. We'll zoom through some Impressionist gardens and then spend some time in the 20th century looking at modern and contemporary abstractions. Like I said, I bit off more than I could chew tonight, but there's so many great examples. So let's get started with our divine blooms. We're going all the way back to the early 1400s. We're in Northern Europe right now, and we have an example on the left side of the screen from the artist Jan van Eyck. It's a detail of his image of the Annunciation. We have a similar scene from the artist Hans Memling Van Eyck was on the left. Memling is on the right here. We can see very similar compositions, same subject matter. The angel Gabriel coming to the Virgin Mary, telling her that she is divinely pregnant with the Son of God. I love these kinds of paintings. As an aside, I always love to see what Mary's reaction to that news is. But in this case, I mean, there's so many wonderful details in these pictures. But let's zero in on the flowers. And in this case, the flowers are in the exact same position. Makes me wonder who saw whose work first, right? So I'm going to zoom in on the Van Eyck flowers here. These are, of course, white lilies, and the white lilies come to signify Mary's purity, Mary's chastity, Mary's virginity. So they're oftentimes used in images of the Annunciation. And there they are, front and center, right before her. Sometimes you see the angel Gabriel sort of delivering those flowers to her. And we have something very similar over here on the right in Memling's painting. But I'm going to zoom in for you here because there's a couple of subtle differences. First of all, you'll notice that some of these white lilies have not blossomed yet. We can see them in bud stage and just beginning to open up and then in full blossom. So we sort of have this passage of time. And in this case, that might even represent the life of Christ, because usually when you see a purple iris like this at this time period, it's there to represent the passion of Christ. So his death, his sacrifice. So Mary's virginity is encapsulated here, as well as the death of her son. And if we zoom out once again, you can see that there are angels here that are kind of supporting Mary, who's almost fainting or falling backwards from this news, because not only is she learning that she's divinely pregnant, she's also learning the fate of her unborn son. It's all wrapped up there in the flowers, and that's why she needs sort of the hands of those angels there to support her. So it's really kind of fascinating to see how just, one blossom there can change the meaning of the entire picture. Now, here is one of the most famous images from this time period. This is the Marode altarpiece done by Robert Campen right around 1430 or so. And this is a hinged altarpiece that can open and close, and it's rather small in scale. It would have been made for private devotion. At the center, again, we have an Annunciation scene. There's our angel Gabriel, there's the Virgin Mary who is reading, seemingly unaware of his presence, but the artist tells us that that this is the moment she becomes pregnant. I'm going to zoom in here on the still life on the table between them. We can see the candle has just been extinguished, again, representing like this is the moment. We can also see again these white lilies. In this case, we see them in three. So that's a nice reference to the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We also see them in various stages of blossoming. So again, it's that reference to the entire life or the entire pregnancy of Mary in this case. Now, if we zoom back out on the Marode altarpiece, I want to draw your attention to this left panel, and this is known as the donor panel. These are not images of the divine. These are images of the people that paid for the painting. So they are represented in a different architectural space than the divine at the center. And of course, they're represented on their knees. They're there to worship, right? So we're going to zoom in on that donor panel. And the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the fact that they are actually in an enclosed garden. So that enclosed garden is a frequently used motif when representing Mary, because an enclosed garden, again, represents her chastity, her purity, how her body has been closed off to the world. But the actual flowers here, again, have special meaning. And what always blows me away when I look at this painting in particular is the care that the artist had in terms of rendering these minute details. So we're going to zero in on some of these grasses and tiny little flowers in the foreground of this particular panel. And each one of them has symbolic significance that relates back to the Virgin Mary. So in particular, we have some forget-me-nots here in the foreground, which are also referred to as the eyes of Mary, and some violets over here, which symbolize her modesty, her faithfulness, and her spiritual wisdom. Even the strawberries are very closely associated with Mary. We could probably get into what every blade of grass here means, but for our purposes tonight, I'm going to just point out one other important flower in this scene. A little bit further up, there is a rose bush. It's a red rose bush. And at the time, there was sort of like this legend, the saying that white roses turned red when the blood from the crucifixion touched the blossom. So, red roses are associated with Mary for her charity, but also with Jesus for his sacrifice. So, those two things are kind of brought together with this flower. So, the presence of all of these blossoms in this picture is not by accident, by any stretch of the imagination. It's there to underscore the important meaning that a viewer would be drawing from an image like this. Now, just to hit this idea home, I just wanted to show you one last Annunciation scene. And I find this one so fascinating because it's from such a different perspective. It's kind of like a bird's eye view. We've got the Holy Spirit represented as a dove up here in the sky, and we're kind of like another bird up there. So we can see our angel Gabriel, we can see Mary, and we can see those white lilies right there. It's sort of at the center of the composition. But just beyond the angel Gabriel, we can see another reference to the enclosed garden, which is typically there to represent Mary's purity and chastity. I'll zoom in once again, and you can see we've got our red rose bush, but there are a number of variety of flowers here, and art historians have spent a great deal of time tracking down their precise botanical history and also their specific symbolism at this time. And of course, they are all related to Mary from this period. So I love the care and concern that's put into building out these scenes representing this important message here. So I have another northern altarpiece that I'd like to share with you. You might have seen this one in person actually in Italy. This is at the Uffizi Gallery. This is Hugo van der Gogh's Portinari altarpiece. And it's kind of a combo painting. It's a little bit of the nativity. It's a little bit of an adoration scene. We have the Christ child in the center panel here on the ground. The Virgin Mary in a lovely blue dress is kneeling above him. We can see the ox and the ass, various shepherds and angels and saints and donors all surrounding and adoring the Christ child. But for our purposes tonight, most importantly, right front and center in this painting, there's a floral still life. Isn't that interesting? It sort of takes us in to this picture. So we are, of course, going to zoom in on it and better understand what are these flowers and why are they there. So on the left, there are scarlet lilies and white and purple irises representing the Passion of Christ. Over here, we have some columbines that represent the Holy Spirit. These three red carnations are oftentimes used to represent the crucifixion and the nails specifically in Christ's body. And then on the ground, we see violets representing Mary's humility. So we have, again, this whole arrangement of flowers that sort of spell out everything that's happening beyond in this painting. It's a really kind of smart combination that explains the entire array of figures here. Now, you might be wondering about these vessels here. I thought this glass over here looks like a modern day drinking vessel. This is a really unusual vessel beside it. This would have been an apothecary jar. In fact, all of these flowers would have had medicinal purposes during the 1400s. And this altarpiece was, in fact, commissioned for a hospital setting. So imagine being a patient in this hospital. Not only are you looking to Jesus for some sort of sense of salvation here, but it's these flowers, it's the very medicine that you might be receiving that is bringing you closer to Jesus while you're meditating upon this. It's pretty incredible. Now, the last artist I'd like to introduce you to for this section about divine blossoms is the Italian artist Botticelli. And he was so well known for these beautiful Madonnas that he would paint, the Madonna and Child. So over here on the left, we have a fairly early image of the Madonna with the Madonna of Roses, essentially. She's in an enclosed garden, and we can see that it's punctuated by these beautiful red and pink roses here. We already have that sense of the meaning of the enclosed garden, the red roses, a reference to her charity. Now, a slightly later Botticelli and a much more complicated one is this round tondo format painting that we see over on the right. And there's a complex array of flowers here. We can see piles of roses in the background, just above the heads of the six angels that are flanking her. We can see these white lilies, again, in various stages of bud and blossom. And then we see a few of these angels that are punctuated or dotted by these flowers. We have a crown of roses over here. And then on Mary's right side, we actually have an angel who is wearing a crown of jasmine here, which is fascinating. Jasmine blooms in May, and the month of May is associated closely with the Virgin Mary. So there's the tie-in for you there. This last angel on our right side has this purple blue cornflower wrapped around his wrist, and that is symbolic of Christ in heaven. So again, there's an entire floral display here, adding this coded meaning to understanding these religious pictures here. Now, Botticelli is actually going to serve as our bridge to the Renaissance proper, really, to the 1500s. And he's going to take us into this new mode of understanding flowers, this scientific curiosity. I love that he can sort of do both religious symbolism and scientific curiosity. So we are going to take a look at his famous painting, the Primavera, or the Allegory of Spring. This is from the 1480s. And so it's really done right around the time of some of his religious paintings, but his interest in flowers here is completely different. It's a springtime picture, so of course there's an abundance of plant life here, but there's almost a hyper focus on it. This painting contains over 500 identified plant species. First of all, it's set in an orange grove, and then we can see that there's this goddess of springtime named Flora, who's wearing a floral print dress and sort of scattering around flower petals on the ground. We can see just behind her a nymph figure. Art historians still debate who exactly she is, but this wind god has swept in, and we imagine, the wind sort of stirring up the seeds and spreading them around in the spring. And the second he has captured this nymph, there are flowers sprouting from her mouth. But right now, I'd like to have you focus on just the ground in this picture because there's so much going on here. There are approximately 190 different kinds of flowers featured in this painting, and 130 of them can be specifically identified. What is Botticelli doing? Why are these flowers suddenly so important here? It's like he's giving us almost like an encyclopedic view of what was understood about flowers up until this time in history. It's pretty astonishing. So he's cataloging things for us. He's not presenting them necessarily for any sort of religious purpose, although they kind of underscore this idea of springtime, but he's giving us more of a scientist's interest in indexing what is known with a picture like this. We get the same sort of effect with this very famous tapestry that we're looking at here. If you're like me, you probably think of tapestries as being sort of more of the medieval period, but this is a very late tapestry, the famous unicorn in captivity or the unicorn at rest in a garden. It's part of a 7 tapestry series that is in the collection of the Cloisters Museum down in New York City. And we could spend a lot of time talking about the meaning or the varied interpretations of those unicorn tapestries, but for our purposes tonight, we're going to zero in on the flowers. This kind of tapestry was referred to by the French as mille fleurs, translated to literally thousands of flowers. And it's a particular approach to portraying them because It's not a repeating pattern. We can see a wide variety of blossoms here. And for the most part, they kind of touch, but they don't really overlap. So you have this kind of dense pattern here. It goes all the way from the bottom of the composition to the top of the composition. It's almost overwhelming that way. And you really have to search for the kinds of flowers that you're most interested in. I should say too, there's several dozen varieties of flowers here, and they are not necessarily scientifically perfect, but very close to it. We can zero in on a couple of details here. So again, we can see some purple irises in the foreground. We can see the minute details of living things that can cohabitate with these flowers. We can, of course, see in both of these images the dragonflies hovering above. And if you have really good eyes, there's a little frog over here in the bottom right too. So I consider this kind of a Where's Waldo approach to image making. It's just so dense. You spend a lot of time looking at this. So again, it makes you ponder what was the artist's goal here in terms of capturing as many different plant varieties as possible. It's this new shift into understanding the world around you. Now, this next image that I'm going to show you is one of my favorites for tonight. And it's not encyclopedic in its scope, but it does show us a wide variety of flowers here. The artist is Giuseppe Arcimboldo. This is his composite head representing the season of spring, painted in 1563. Arcimboldo was sort of considered a madman during the Renaissance because he made a number of these composite heads, various seasons, various themes, and he would take elements from that theme and use it to create a face like we see here, usually in portrait. So for spring, of course, he zeroes in on flowers and he gives us again, dozens of plant varieties here. I love that he uses a rose for a rosy cheek. He's used boysenberries for the eyeballs. We can see the daisies representing a high collar here, and then this dense jungle of green leaves representing a coat. You might be wondering about that white lily sticking out of the back of the head. Is that just for comedy? No, that's like the feather in this figure's cap. So there's a lot of fanciful elements here, but again, this kind of dedication to painting as many possible varieties as the artist is able. And like I said, there's dozens of plants here. Now, if you're as interested in Arcimboldo as I am, you might love the fact that his paintings are sometimes translated into these over life-size sculptures. They typically tour botanical gardens. You can see how big they are in relation to the figures over here on the right in the image on the left. You can see also the other seasons represented. There's winter in the distance. It's fun to see it. It's also a little terrifying, let's be honest, right? So here is yet another scientific approach to painting flowers that comes to us in the early years of the 1500s. Again, you might think of illuminated manuscript painting as more of a medieval genre, but artists continue to do this right through the Renaissance. The pages that we're looking at here are in the collection of the Getty Museum, and they date to about 1520 or so. There are paintings of the apostles actually writing the Gospels here. But let's face it, the star of the show, the stars, are all of these little cut blossoms here that seem to be resting on the surface of the page itself. So you can imagine this would have been a devotional text. It would have been probably a small prayer book that you would have held in your hands, and it would have felt like all of these little blossoms had been cut specifically to rest on that page, or maybe fallen from a nearby garden. But we see this wide variety, some familiar things like columbines and irises that probably have religious symbolism. A friend of mine saw this and said, this reminds me of like what you would see right before you close a book and press those flowers and keep them permanent. They do have this wonderful three-dimensionality with all of their own individual shadows here. And I love that interpretation. But the longer I thought about it, the more I began to see things like the bugs and and the strawberries and the snails. So I have a little trouble now thinking about pressing all of that into a book, but there is this wonderful immediacy and this wide variety that we see represented here. Now, the inclusion of the bugs and the snails gives us just a little hint of like the ecology that's involved when we're thinking about flowers in a more scientific vein. And that's what we begin to see in the Renaissance. This is such an outstanding example. This is Albert Durer's famous watercolor known as the Great Piece of Turf from the early years of the 1500s. This is painted on a sheet of paper that's just a little bit bigger than your standard size copy paper. And we can see that the artist has painstakingly recorded a wide variety of meadow grasses here, dandelions, importantly, and just the kinds of things that we would consider weeds, right? He's given us a little bit of their root structure as well. It's almost as though Durer was lying in your front yard with a magnifying glass, wanting to capture all of these things just perfectly. He's turning a scientific eye to his subject, and yet he renders it poetically. So, this idea of capturing the world with a scientist's eye is really what characterizes the art of the Renaissance. And he is paving the way for other artists like Basilius Besler, who was working several decades later, but studying in a garden, essentially a wide botanical garden. He went about trying to document as many flower species as he possibly could for this publication, which was hand colored. So we see some tulips over here on the left in a number of colors here, even including these flamed tulips. We'll be talking about tulips a little bit later, but notice how he's rendered them with their anatomical bulbs here too. He's trying to give us like the full sense of this flower. With the sunflower, however, he just focuses really on the face of that sunflower. And he wasn't the first person to ever paint a sunflower, but this is one of the most striking, most majestic renderings of a sunflower from this period. And we are face to face with it, seeing it in all of its glory. Now, I have one last artist here that I would include in this section about, scientific curiosity. This is the artist Maria Sibylla Miriam, and she really came to flowers by way of bugs. She was somebody who was very interested in bug life, and so unlike any of the other publications that came before her, she wanted to show the entire life cycle of an insect on one page. So by default, she kind of had to show where bugs lived and what they ate. We are looking at her depiction of a passion flower with its fruit and this variety of caterpillars here. Now, something really impressive about this woman artist is that she actually self-funded a trip to South America and lived there for about 3 years, documenting all of these plant and insect species. She later published this work and became really like an international sensation. So we see this nice variety in terms of the way that Renaissance era artists really started to zero in on the scientific approach to painting flowers. It sort of continues on as we turn our attention to the Dutch Golden Age. This term here, memento mori, such a great term. I'm going to write out for you here what it translates to. Remember, you must die. Whew, it's a little heavy, right? And it's not remember you must die, so live it up while you're here. It's remember you must die, so live the best, most pious life you can while you're here, so your afterlife can be so glorious. Now, if you're familiar with Dutch Baroque art genre, I should say the still life genre just kind of exploded during this time. And so there's lots of like banqueting scenes with skulls. That's a memento mori symbol. But there are a ton of floral still lifes too. And usually that memento mori element in a floral still life is is the dying or the decaying elements in that bouquet. So it was important to show a wide variety of flowers from bud to blossom to decay. So let me show you one of the most prominent early examples of the Dutch instinct for creating these floral still lifes. This one is painted by the artist uh, Jan Bruegel the Elder, and it's generally called the Great Bouquet, also flowers in a wooden vessel. It dates to 1606, and it measures roughly 2 feet across and 3 feet high. And every time I look at this picture, I kind of get, I'm sort of tickled by it because Bruegel has represented about 130 different kinds of flowers in this one painting, from all of these tiny little blossoms at the bottom to like these huge stalks and giant blossoms at the top. It just seems totally impossible. I don't know much about floral arrangement, but it seems like an impossible bouquet. It is an impossible bouquet because many of these flowers do not blossom at the same time of year. So it's like unimagined bouquet. Now, that memento mori element, very important here. I'm going to zero in on these white lilies over here. We see the bud, we see the blossom, and we begin to see the flower wilting and those beautiful petals starting to shrivel up. And throughout this composition, you see floral groupings that do the exact same thing. You can sort of see the same thing playing out with the roses just down below. The other great thrill about looking at floral paintings from this time period is that artists are continuing to include things like the insects and the snails. So, I mean, we could spend the rest of this hour just kind of zooming through this picture here and discovering the moths, the flies, and the bugs that are embedded in this scene. Now, this is a great painting, but wait until you see what comes next. The Dutch just they excel at this particular genre. We have examples from two different artists on the screen here. On the left is an artist named De Heem, and on the right is Van Alst. These are roughly from mid 1600s. And we can see that there's an even more elevated approach to floral still life painting by this time. A couple of things of note. We see the tulips. The Dutch are so closely associated with the tulips. They have this love of tulips. In both of these pictures, we have the flamed tulip. Now, you might have heard of tulip mania before, too. That was the first real financial bubble in financial history. It's because the Dutch loved these flowers that were being imported so much. They were willing to pay exorbitant amounts of money for tulips. Tulips were luxury items. They were your Mercedes Benz, they were your Rolex watch. At one point, tulips got so expensive that one tulip was apparently equal to 10 years of a skilled craftsman's salary. So, of course, that bubble's going to burst at some point, right? There's all this speculation, people investing in the planting of tulips. So the bubble bursts. And interestingly, these flamed or striped tulips were especially difficult to cultivate because that striped pattern came about as a result of a disease. So even harder to breed these. So we have the focus on the tulips, but there's so many other things to talk about here. I'm going to guide you through this image on the left. Notice that there is this one stalk of wheat that sort of curves down into the foreground, and it's the form of it is sort of echoed by the vine of these pea pods over here. Now, if you look very closely, you can also see a dying stalk of wheat in the background and some dying pea pods over here. So again, we have that notion of memento mori here. We also oftentimes see these floral still lifes presented on a marble slab, which oftentimes has a crack in it or a chunk taken out of it, reminding us that everything turns to dust. Nothing is permanent, right? I want to also point out to you, we're going to zoom in on this one because isn't this just a gorgeous glass vessel that he has painted for this floral still life. Notice that you can see the reflection of his window in his artist studio in that glass vessel. We can also begin to see things like snails. Apparently, snails were symbolic of keeping secrets at the time. There's another one right up here. We can also see a little lizard and a little spider. Spiders didn't have any sort of sinister meaning, as far as I understand. They were more or less representative of like being industrious. So all sorts of marvelous details. Look at the texture of this one leaf here. I mean, everything is spectacular. If we move over to the Van Alst on the right, I mean, just these pink roses alone are a knockout, but we also have this timepiece that's open in the foreground. It has this lovely blue ribbon that is counterbalanced by the blue violet of that iris at the top of the composition. There's just so much to love about these paintings. Van Alst was known for these strong diagonals here. He also had well, some kind of relationship with this next artist, Maria van Oosterwijk. They actually had studios across the street from each other. And apparently, Van Alst once proposed to this lovely lady that we see here. Apparently, she rejected him. She just wanted to focus on her art and on her spirituality. She was said to be unusually religious for the time period. So I love in this portrait of her, she's sitting there with her painter's palette and her brushes while also apparently reading the Bible, right? So with her lovely floral still lifes, we see a lot of religious symbolism. So there's the memento mori and the religious symbolism. It's all kind of coming together in her lovely paintings. She liked to use the image of this red butterfly as symbolic of Christ's resurrection. If we think about the metamorphosis of, from caterpillar to butterfly, it's like the rebirth of Jesus. So we oftentimes see that. Again, we have this great glass vessel here with the reflection of her studio window. We have another spider and various other insects including. But going back to her spirituality in particular, these next two images both have sunflowers in them, as well as those red butterflies too. But sunflowers, when we think about sunflowers being planted in the ground, of course, they follow the light of the sun over the course of the day. And it was said that sunflowers were sort of representative of a faithful soul, kind of following Christ's model. And so in these compositions for these paintings, she actually used sunflowers as representative of the sun itself. And notice how in both paintings, she has faced a pink flower directly engaging with the face of that sun. So that is her faithful soul in both of these compositions. And of course, just breathtaking work in terms of the flowers, that suggestion of the leaves and some of these blossoms that are just starting to wilt and decay, the familiar things like the chunks missing from the marble slabs, and of course all of these wonderful bugs. I have one last Dutch Baroque artist I'd like to introduce you to. Her name is Rachel Rocha, and she was really just the best. She was a highly celebrated painter working at the end of the 1600s into the 1700s. She painted about 250 of these compositions, and really her reputation has never waned. So she was known for creating a bouquet that looks very informal, kind of thrown together. And of course, this one has the sunflower that's kind of falling out of it. We can see here the preciseness, the precision in terms of how she's painted every petal, every leaf. My eye always goes to these kind of tropical leaves over here. They look like almost like fabric. It looks like a beautifully sewn dress that's like intentionally puckered in a way. It's just a knockout of a painting. As a fun fact, this artist did not get married until she was 29 years old. I'm sure everybody thought she was going to be a spinster, but after that, she went on to have 10 children and was internationally renowned. Quite a life there. All right, we're going to switch gears. We're going to zoom forward through time into the 1800s and examine the secret language of flowers from the Victorian era. So we're really kind of based in England now. And what I mean by the secret language is that we have this emerging phenomenon at this time, floriography. There are people writing books about the meaning of flowers. We kind of take this for granted now. We have a good sense for the most part, what a flower might mean, a red rose versus a yellow rose, a carnation, but all of this was spelled out in great detail in texts at the time. The combination of flowers, what that meant, how they were presented, if they were handed to you upright or like lying on their side in a bouquet. So all of this had special meaning. And I think it's important too to think about sort of the British culturally speaking too, because we think of them as being more reserved than Americans for the most part. And if you think about it, if there are some emotional things that you don't feel like you could say it with flowers. So not only did people understand this symbolism, but of course artists did too. So particularly artists that were a part of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, this movement in the second half of the 1800s that really focused on precise detail, these vivid colors, and not really relying on formulas for painting. So this is John Everett Millet's painting of Ophelia dating to 1852. This is at the Tate. It is, of course, a literary subject, but the artist here spent weeks working outside, documenting the natural world in this precise detail. There's plenty of flowers available here, from like these purple flowers in the distance. There's some right along the riverbank, these white blossoms just across the way. But he went back to this painting after the fact, inside, working indoors, and he added the figure of Ophelia, who, of course, was Hamlet's love interest, who drowns herself after Hamlet kills her father. And the whole array of flowers, from like her feet across her dress all the way up to her head, has special significance. So we'll just zero in on her face here. She's like taking her last gasp before she falls beneath the surface of the water here. We notice that there is this little rose right next to her temple. In Hamlet, she is referred to as the Rose of May. So it's probably no accident that that's there. There are a chain of violets around her neck, which stand for faithfulness, chastity, and the death of the young. Functions on all of those levels right there. There's other things like pansies and forget-me-nots in the water. But I also, most importantly, need to draw your attention to that red poppy at the bottom of your screen. And we always remember what poppies mean, right? Because we've all seen The Wizard of Oz. And the Wicked Witch of the West says poppies, poppies will make them sleep. So poppies are associated with sleep and with death. And of course, they're associated with opium as well, which kind of leads to sleep and death as well. So this arrangement of flowers here again sort of underscores the meaning of the picture, the story of Ophelia within the play of Hamlet. So it's all kind of comes together with these beautiful little pops of color. Now, the leader of this artistic movement, of the pre-Raphaelite movement, was an artist by the name of Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And this is his painting called Lady Lilith from 1873. Kind of like Norman Rockwell, Rossetti was an artist who never met a redhead he didn't want to paint. He basically only painted these stunning redheads with the long auburn locks. So Lady Lilith here just looks like this gorgeous vixen who's combing her hair and gazing at her own lovely reflection. But there's an array of flowers here that tell us who she is. She was the mythological first wife to the biblical figure of Adam. She is associated with the seduction of men and the murder of children. So, how does that come about in flowers? Well, just beyond her are all of these white roses, which suggest kind of a cold and sensuous love, also a cruel detachment. Just beyond her are these pink foxgloves, which represent the keeping of secrets and insincerity. She sort of looks like someone who might lie to you, right? But then again, most importantly, we've got our poppy at the lower right-hand corner of the picture. That's death. Lady Lilith is a dangerous woman. And if you couldn't get that just by like the sheer impressiveness of this of her scale in this little frame, then you get it from your understanding of the flowers painted here. Now, believe it or not, we're going to look at a more dangerous flower painting now. The artist is Lawrence Alma Tadema. He's another pre-Raphaelite artist. He was Dutch but moved to England, and he, even though he's painting during this Victorian time, the subject that he loved to paint most was ancient Rome. And so this is a story that he has painted from ancient Rome. It's probably not a true story, but that doesn't stop him. It's known as the flowers of Heliogalabus. Heliogalabus is our Roman emperor. He is this lounging figure wearing gold. And he, according to history, apparently one time hosted an elaborate banquet. And during that banquet, he had a false ceiling pulled back, and and all of these flower petals showered down on his banquet guests to smother them to death. So what at first glance seems like this absolutely gorgeous painting with all of these beautiful rose petals floating through the air, this is actually a scene of mass murder that we're looking at. And I think you can sort of get that by zeroing in on this guy's face over here. He's sort of like, what is going on? Um, What's interesting is that our artist, Lawrence Alma Tadema, changes one critical thing when it comes to translating this ancient Roman story into a painting. Uh, in the original telling of the story, these were not rose petals, but he imagines that they are rose petals specifically because roses represent this kind of sensual beauty, but also danger and even sometimes death. So that's what's unfolding here. And he thought that that was the perfect flower to tell this story. One last painting from Lawrence Alma Tadema for you. This one is called The Eloquent Silence. What an interesting title, right? What would an eloquent silence sound like? Well, we've got these two ancient Roman figures here who look like maybe they've had a lover's spat, or maybe he's thinking about how to strike up a conversation with this lovely lady, but they do seem lost in their own individual thoughts. The flowers here tell us so much about how to understand the painting. The flower is clematis. It had been recently imported to England at this time, and it was all the rage. People loved that it was a climbing flower. And so it was meant to have this symbolic meaning of sort of like a mental agility, as sort of cleverness, because of the flower's ability to climb in this way and sort of work around obstacles in its path. So in this eloquent silence, you can imagine that both of these figures are probably coming up with something very clever to offer their companion next. Okay, we have to move quickly. So we are going to fly through some Impressionist gardens. I know many of you have seen other programs from me where we've talked about artists like Monet and Van Gogh. So let's just sort of dance across the surface of these pictures in the same way that light dances across the surface of an Impressionist painting. Now, what's most important here is knowing that with this new style of Impressionism that came about in the 1860s and 1870s in France, artists had to work outside. They were unshackled from their studios and they could paint not just a floral still life, but they could go outside and paint a whole garden. And so this is, of course, Renoir's famous depiction of Claude Monet painting in his garden. Now we have come a long way from those gorgeous Dutch Baroque still lifes, and now a flower is just a red dot of paint Do you feel kind of cheated? I kind of do. But the end result is always so lovely. We get this immediate impression of this moment of light and shadow in these works, with these artists rapidly executing these kind of sketchy paintings outdoors in a short amount of time. Now, with Claude Monet, we know that he loved to garden. This man loved flowers. They kind of buoyed him and his mental health throughout his life. And whenever he and his family would rent a property, he would always really play up the gardens. So we can see this is probably his wife and child over here at the center. This is their house in Argenteuil, and we can see the beautiful flower beds just suggested by all of these little dabs of color. We can also see a house, like a vine covered house, and all of these white and blue glazed pots that he would use for particular plantings. I mean, who among us wouldn't want to be transported to that scene, that lovely garden that he's just suggested through that rapid application of paint? Over here on the right, it's another rented property. In this case, Monet actually struck up a deal with his landlord so that he could get a reduced rent if he worked on the landscaping. So he has planted these incredible tall corridors of sunflowers. And there again are those glazed pots of the white and blue planters right there in the foreground. So we get these gorgeous sun-drenched scenes, but of course, when it comes to Monet, we all think of Giverny and his water lily garden. Here we can see this man-made garden, this space that he created just so he could paint the flowers. And we see the white and sort of yellowish blossoms of those water lilies in this composition. I love that the water lily pads have that little tinge of lavender to them. The whole thing's framed by the Japanese inspired bridge over the top. We get a little bit of its reflection at the bottom. This was painted in 1899, the same year that Monet went to the Universal Exhibition in Paris. The Eiffel Tower is unveiled, and most importantly, Monet meets somebody who had developed a hybrid form of the water lily, a form of water lily that had blossoms in a variety of colors. And based on that alone, Monet continued to expand the size, the scope of his water lily pond. And we begin to see these brilliant, beautiful colors included in these compositions. Now, I love these paintings here because if we compare them to the Dutch Baroque, where we could see like an artist's window reflected in the vase, now it's like the entire vase is that pond, and it's giving us the entire reflection of the sky here. It's a nice transition, isn't it? So we have his beautiful paintings here that completely, well, eventually take up the entire painting. He doesn't even care about, the edge of the pond, the willow stems hanging down, giving us a sense of space here. It really is about these water lily pads and those beautiful blossoms kind of resting on the surface of the canvas there. So we're not going to leave France without a little taste of Vincent van Gogh too. How can you talk about flowers without some sunflowers? Vincent van Gogh knew when he started painting these sunflowers in the 1880s, he said, "The sunflower is mine." He had landed on something so remarkable with these paintings. Now, he was an artist who was kind of low-key obsessed with color theory. He always wanted to balance out his compositions. If there was going to be a lot of yellow and orange, you needed a lot of blue and purple there. But he made so many of these sunflower paintings that are just filled with yellow. And to Vincent van Gogh, the sunflower represented gratitude. So every time I see a sunflower, it's like a little thank you from Vincent van Gogh. And I mean, what's so thrilling about these paintings, these compositions, is that we get this wonderful sense of energy and movement with the undulating line of the stems, and then each individual petal, which seems to have a life of its own. Now, he was working in France, but Vincent van Gogh was a Dutch artist who was very aware of his Dutch roots. So, of course, like those Dutch Baroque artists that we saw before, he was interested in bud, blossom, and decay. So we've got some decaying sunflowers here at the center of our or at the center of our slide. Um, Van Gogh is also closely associated with these purple irises. This is a painting that he created just a few months after he severed his ear and moved into an asylum to get help with his mental health. He started this painting the day after he moved in, and he wrote about how he thought about it as a lightning rod for his mental illness. If he just kept working on it, like he'd be okay. This was a man who could crank out a masterpiece in like a day and a half, and this was 3 weeks of his time. It is a magnificent painting. I love how these blossoms kind of come into our space here at the foreground, the bottom of the picture, and they bring us further in. Again, he has animated every petal here, given each one of these flowers like a sense of movement and like a sense of its personality. There's that solitary white iris there. You could read a lot into that, especially considering how alone he must have felt as he had just become this transplant into this asylum setting. So, one last flower painting from Vincent van Gogh. This one is called Almond Blossoms, painted it in 1890. If you're familiar with Van Gogh, you know that his little brother Theo was like his lifeline to the world. Theo took care of him emotionally and financially. And in the early part of the year, Theo got in touch with his brother Vincent and said, I just had a baby, and we named him Vincent after you. And Vincent van Gogh was so touched by 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 this gesture that he painted this image for his newborn nephew named after him. And he decided to paint almond blossoms because they are the first to bloom in spring. And to him, that was hope and that was renewal. And so his little nephew kept this painting with him his entire life and ultimately was the founder essentially of the Vincent van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, which is where this painting still resides. So, in the time that we have left, we are going to just move right through the 20th century. Might go a little bit long. Let's turn our attention to modern abstractions. And we're going to start off with Gustav Klimt because I absolutely love his flower paintings. They're a little bit like those Impressionist gardens, right? A lot of short, sketchy brushstrokes here. You don't get the sense that he's aiming for botanical accuracy, really, until you start looking at those gorgeous sunflowers. This image over here on the right in particular, we can see a real interest in capturing the variety of shades of the leaves here. And there were critics at the time that kind of associated this figure of the sunflower to a human figure. Somebody wrote, it looks like a love-struck fairy whose greenish-gray robes flow down with passionate tremors. Not surprisingly, he painted it right around the same time that he painted his most famous work, The Kiss. You can see the similarities in the compositions, the heads placed in very similar positions, and even this sense of being out on a cliff. The shimmering background is not gold here, but it certainly does seem to shimmer, doesn't it? It's almost like a leafy green forest in the middle of like the hot summer, and you can imagine the wind sort of moving through those leaves and creating that wonderful shimmer effect. Now, we're staying in the modern era, and of course, you've been waiting for this moment, right? Some Georgia O'Keeffe. You can't talk about flowers and art without a little Georgia O'Keeffe. So she is considered the greatest flower painter of all time, I would say. With her compositions, she invites us to zoom in. She crops flowers in such a way that we see them in a new way. She never painted bugs or moths or anything in her compositions, but As one critic at the time said, she makes us feel like we're the little butterflies resting on her petals. This is her painting of hibiscus flowers, blue and pink. Here we get a little bit of, or sorry, yellow and pink with a little bit of blue sky in the background. She's not even focusing on the petals here. It's really about this gorgeous undulating line, the shape of the flower itself, and the stamen as well. The kind of scientific accuracy of that element of these flowers. But for the most part, we think of her as a colorist. She painted a series of white roses in 1927, and two of the works from that series also have these lovely blue-violet larkspurs in them too. One of these is at the MFA in Boston. And with these flowers, we're reminded what Georgia O'Keeffe said. She said, people move about their daily lives, but they rarely stop to look at a flower, to truly look at it. We always say, stop and smell the roses. She wanted us to stop and look at the roses. So there are just these gorgeous transitions from one color to the next. We can see how she's using like the reflection of that green, of the green leaf that is reflecting onto the petal. We get a little bit of yellow here at the center, and then some gray and a little bit of that blue at the top. So the longer you spend with these flowers, the more you begin to appreciate them. Georgia O'Keeffe's paintings can completely consume you, right? They are absorbing, they are intimate, they are sometimes deliberately challenging in terms of their sensuality. Are they flower paintings? Are they something else? But they helped to establish her as a significant painter in the 1920s. By the time she had painted this tulip that we're looking at here in 1926, she was the most famous woman artist in America. She probably still is. The power of a flower right there. I want to briefly introduce you to Raoul Dufy, who was an expert in seascapes and floral bouquets. We're just going to do this very quickly. I just want to show you the confidence, the kind of breeziness that he would use to create an arrangement like this. And he had an interesting approach. He would lay in the color with a watercolor, and then he would go back over it with this bold calligraphic line and create the sense of that blossom. So he's literally divorcing color and line in these compositions, but it's just so effective. A really satisfying painting. Now, are you ready to be completely disappointed by Picasso? I have a Picasso in here. He was charged with creating an image for a peace protest or peace demonstration in 1958 in Stockholm, Sweden. Instead of going for the obvious white dove, which doesn't make for a really compelling image, he wanted to use color, and he thought, what better way to convey peace than with the handing of a floral bouquet from one hand to the next. You never give somebody flowers with bad intentions, right? But this is all rendered very simply in a very childlike way with, again, these very confident lines here and very simplified petal forms as well. We won't spend too much time on this, but I will say it's a good marketing image. We will zoom through the last 50 years or so. Of course, Andy Warhol had his hand at flower painting too. Fresh off the success of the Campbell soup cans, he endeavored to cover a more traditional subject in art. And he thought, what's better than a floral still life? But Andy Warhol didn't engage with flowers. He didn't start carefully looking at flowers in a garden. Instead, he found somebody else's photograph of flowers, began to silk screen that, and then added a variety of colors to that silk screened image. And even though Campbell Soup never went after him for copyright infringement, apparently the original photographer of these flowers did. So he got into a little bit of trouble for that. But in the end, I think it's a really satisfying composition. And the wonderful way he plays with color here is also really pleasing to the eye. So moving right along, there are plenty of other pop artists working around Andy Warhol's circle and in with the same sort of fanciful approach to art making. We know Yayoi Kusama is one of the most popular artists on the planet right now, but she really emerged really kind of just before Andy Warhol. She grew up on a seed nursery in Japan where she had a couple of traumatic experiences and began to hallucinate. So she hallucinated red polka dots on everything as a child. She also hallucinated flowers becoming sort of human like and talking to her. We see a little bit of that in her two-dimensional and three-dimensional work here. But there is kind of a feed me Seymour little shop of horrors element to her sculpture over here, which is located in Beverly Hills in California. The next pop artist I want to introduce you to is Roy Lichtenstein, and I just love his work. I think there's always some really funny element to them. He's probably best known for his comic book like paintings. In this case, he's painted a floral still life, but he adds the pop element to it, where it has not necessarily painted flowers, he's painted the brush strokes. So we can see each individual brushstroke is outlined with this solid black line that looks almost more like a cartoon. He's barely even elucidated the flowers. There's just a little bit of color here. So probably a little bit of a commentary in terms of what's happening in the art market too when it was painted. Like how is something painted versus what it actually represents? So a really smart kind of fun painting here. Now we are looking at sculpture. This is done by the contemporary artist Jeff Koons, who's always kind of exploring that tension between high culture and low culture. This floral bouquet here, let's face it, it's a little cutesy. It looks like it could be on, a Hallmark card. There's a variety of flowers here, probably about 130 of them. They all look perfect. It doesn't have that memento mori element to it, does it? This is actually made out of wood. So there's a real unexpected aspect to exploring these flowers. He also exhibited them on display in a gallery that was filled with paintings of him and a woman who was like his brand new wife at the time. So flowers like this were there to kind of point to the really kind of public courting process that's involved when you meet someone and how and to suggest too that flowers oftentimes serve as like a prelude to procreation. So multiple meanings all wrapped up in here. Now, there are a number of artists from the past few decades that use unexpected materials in order to create the delicate petals of a flower, including the glass maker Dale Chihuly, whose work is, always popular. This is an installation that he had in Kew Gardens in London, where he's sort of doing a take on Monet's water lilies. In this case, it's kind of like a translucent glass, and I love how it seems to have this life of its own, sort of emerging out of the water. Over on the right is a ceiling of these multicolored flowers. They are kind of pouring out of this frame down towards the ground into our space. This is an installation at the Bellagio Hotel in Las Vegas. It's so popular that 10 to 20,000 people a day go through that hotel lobby just to see the Dale Chihuly. Now, another artist, contemporary artist here is the Japanese artist Takashi Murakami. And he is best known for these smiling flowers. They look pretty pop, don't they? They've become very popular. They've been licensed to luxury brands like Louis Vuitton. So you could get a Louis Vuitton bag that's also covered in these laughing flowers. And so, kind of appropriately, we can see a three-dimensional rendering here that is cited where else? At Versailles. Who would have thought that, something that would have functioned as like a sticker on a notebook back when I was a kid could be so fancy now. We have just two artists to go. I love Kehinde Wiley, and in this breakthrough painting that he had, that he painted of President Barack Obama back in 2018. breakthrough in the sense that nobody would have ever imagined painting a president sort of in and among these bushes here. There's all this greenery, but the greenery serves a purpose. The greenery is the backdrop for these flowers. And all of these different floral types are there to tell the history of this significant person that we're confronting. So, for example, we get to zoom in on some of these flowers. On the left, there's the purple African lily, which symbolizes Obama's Kenyan heritage. On the right, we have the white jasmine representing Obama's Hawaiian birthplace and time that he spent in Indonesia. We also have a multicolored chrysanthemum here on the left, which represents the city of Chicago, which is where he grew up and eventually became a state senator. And then we just have a couple of rosebuds here too, which obviously represent love, and to the artist Kehinde Wiley, courage as well. So this is sort of going old school. This is like going back almost to the religious significance of flowers, because they kind of hold the key to understanding what this picture is all about. One last artist for you, and I think he's going to knock your socks off. His name is Paul Lang. He was a fashion photographer for like 25 years. He photographed every famous woman you could ever think of. And about 10 years ago, he gave it all up to photograph flowers. He calls this his Big Blooms series. You can find him on Instagram. So he, with this fashion background, he knows exactly the angle, exactly how to illuminate these floral compositions. He captures this color. He captures, this the sort of dense nature of these petals. The way they're organized always looks like a ball gown to me, or somebody's dress kind of unfurling. And he names all of these flowers. He gives them one name, a woman's first name. So you always feel like it's a celebrity that we're looking at. Here are some of his peonies. Look at that. Oh, that pale pink and lavender at the bottom, but then the beautiful folds of those petals at the top. This is Paulina and Kate that we're looking at here. And then very quickly, his dahlias, also knockouts. Look at the abstraction and the composition here. It's like he has found the perfect flower and knows exactly how to portray it. So thank you for a little bit of extra time tonight. We will quickly conclude with just some overarching ideas here. Really, we've seen flowers tonight that were realistic, symbolic, expressive, all things in between. And we've considered the wide variety of ways that artists have explored this tried and true motif. They've all encouraged us to stop and look at these flowers just a little bit longer. I hope you've enjoyed this little walk through history. I'll end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you have about the images we looked at. I'll start looking at the chat here. Let's see. Where are the sculptures inspired by Archimboldo? And that's a great question. At the moment, I do not know. They tend to travel around quite a bit. I would look at major botanical gardens, because that's where I have seen them in the past. Sorry, I don't have that answer handy for you. An anonymous attendee says, what is the small creature in the bottom right of the Bruegel? Let's go back and see if we can figure that out. The bottom right. Let's see. That could be a butterfly. I know it almost, I think if you're looking at what I'm looking at, I think it's a butterfly down here. But it did almost look like a rodent or something. So I can see how it could have been confusing without zooming in. Mary says, in the Dutch still lifes Van Alst, what is the silvery thing floating in the air on the left of the picture? Oh, Mary, thanks for asking. Sorry, I didn't make that clear. Let me go to that one, the Van Alst. This is a dragonfly, but we can't really see its wings. I wonder if we zoom in, if we could see them a little bit better. I guess the resolution isn't that great, or maybe it has been over cleaned and we just can't see that detail. But thank you for asking, Mary. That is a weird detail, and I'm sorry I didn't make that clear. Nancy Parker's here. She said, first slide, Van Eyck, is Gabriel's wing a pride flag? I'm not even sure pride flag existed at that time, but it is a very colorful rainbow set of wings going all the way back. I love them. And it wasn't unusual. I would say this is a particularly beautiful set of wings that Gabriel has, but it wasn't unusual to show him with multicolored wings. But great question. Sort of leads me to promote next month's program, which is on Keith Haring, who is a great artist to spotlight for Pride Month. He was the graffiti artist of the 1980s, and if you're not familiar with his work or only kind of know who he is, you will fall in love with him. So you'll have to join us for that one. Marcia says, I think the Klimt painting with the sunflower at the top looks similar to Ophelia standing up instead of floating in the river. Oh, Marcia, I love that take. We're gonna go back to Klimt's sunflower for just a second. There's Ophelia, of course, and it's sort of like rotating Ophelia here. Let's check it out. Oh yeah, I could absolutely see that. It's like she's floating through that river. Thanks for adding that, Marcia. Let's see here. She also says, I love O'Keeffe's flowers, but I like her time in the Southwest. Agreed. Larry says, are you familiar with Craig Mitchell Smith, a glass artist currently has a show at Brook Green Gardens? I think I actually had him in this program. Nope, I had somebody else. Sorry. I guess I'm not familiar with Craig Mitchell Smith, but Larry, thanks for offering up the name. I'll have to look him up for sure. I'm going to copy that name for later. Thank you, Larry. Sarah says, I missed the name of the artist who did the red dots everywhere. Her name is Yayoi Kusama, and you might be familiar with like her infinity rooms with pumpkins covered in polka dots and that sort of thing. She is generally considered to be the most popular artist on the planet, but I think her name isn't necessarily a household name. Nancy says, who was the artist who did the ones in Austria? Probably we're thinking about Klimt with that. I'm not sure. He's our most famous Austrian artist here, so that might be who you were thinking of, Nancy. Someone else asked, does the ring of flowers on Lilith's lap have significance? Great question. Couldn't tell what kind of flowers they are. I think that I was wondering this myself, and they're not white roses, are they? This is interesting. I'm not sure what kind of flower they are either. If somebody else happens to know, please chime in. They every time I look at this, it's like I forget that they're there, and then I notice them right before we move on, and I always forget to look up those flowers. So if anybody else knows, please feel free to chime in. You're good to point that out for all of us. Patricia, question, what was the name of the last person you mentioned? I will write his name in the chat. He has a website and he's on Instagram. His photographs are incredible, aren't they? Paul Lang. I think it's pronounced Lang or Lange. Oh, Joan says, I believe they are bleeding hearts. Maybe these white flowers here. Interesting. Thanks for adding that, Joan. And I think that covers just about everything. As always, thank you so much for spending your evening with me. I really appreciate it. I really loved this program, so it's an honor to be able to share it with you. Thank you for the kind words that I'm seeing in the chat as well. I look forward to seeing you next month, and anytime in between, you can always go to my website to see what else I'm presenting. There's like a new pop-up program that I'm doing with Tewksbury and Maynard next Thursday morning on color and art. If you want to tune in for that one, there is a link for it on my website, which is iamculturallycurious.com. I'll put that in the chat too. So I'm just going to copy and paste everything in the chat because all of your very kind comments really do mean the world to me. Thank you so much, everybody. I think I touched on everything. Oh, per Google, the poppy crown on Lilith's lap is associated with sleep and forgetfulness. Are those poppies? Interesting. Implying Lilith's languid nature and her tendency to be forgetful. Hmm. I might keep looking into this one. I'm not sure if I buy Google's interpretation here. All right, but thank you for checking on that. Thank you again, everybody. I really appreciate you, and I'll see you next month for a little Keith Haring. Take care, everybody. Have a great night.